So welcome everyone to Ancient Modern. Today we're delighted to have with us Professor Patrick Lee Miller. He's an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Duquesne University. He's the author of Becoming God, Pure Reason in Early Greek Philosophy. Early Greek philosophy, very fascinating topic for people who are listening. And he's published articles, I'm just going to read out this list that you have on your website. He's published articles on Heraclitus, Sophocles, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, Polybius, Augustine, Hobbes, Hamilton, Madison, Darwin, Nietzsche, Mill, Freud, Rawls, Rorty, Judith Butler, and David Lynch. So it's quite a wide span of authors to be dealing with. It also says on your bio, Patrick, his recent philosophical writing uses Platonism to address current problems such as gender, sexuality, child psychology, and a few other things. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So why don't we just start out there, because you say that you're using Platonism. I know that your Twitter handle is Plato4 now, with a 4 Arabic numeral.
Yeah.
So are you a Platonist? Would you call yourself a Platonist? And if so, how? In what sense are you a Platonist?
Yes. So I do consider myself a Platonist. I do wonder sometimes about that Twitter handle, how wise that was. You know how it is. You go on Twitter and you just try to think of something, and that was what I thought of that day. But it was an attempt to summarize my approach, which is how to be a Platonist in the 21st century. I just fear sometimes that it makes it sound like I'm saying I'm Plato for now or or whatever. But yes, I do consider myself a Platonist. And since your podcast is about ancients and moderns, maybe the way into that, what it means for me, is through Nietzsche. Because I think Nietzsche is one of the best readers of Plato. I don't think he gets Plato entirely right, but I think he gets the important stuff right about Plato. And so even though he's very critical, I think he's a useful guide to knowing what Plato was trying to do. And Nietzsche says at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, the preface, he says that Platonism was the great catastrophe of our civilization. You know, he thinks Christianity, for example, is just Platonism for the masses. It was really Platonism that was the error. And the two points of Platonism that he isolates as the catastrophe are the immortal soul and transcendent goodness. So what does it mean to me to be a Platonist? I think it's what it meant to Nietzsche to be a Platonist, and I think what it meant to Plato and the other Platonists to be a Platonist, namely you believe in the immortal soul and you believe in transcendent goodness. Now, just as a footnote, perhaps, another thing that gets associated, I think it was Cornford who said the twin pillars of Platonism are the immortal soul and the forms. Anybody who knows Plato knows, yeah, the forms are really important to Plato, but of all the forms, the form of the good, or just simply the good, is the chief one. So when Nietzsche says the immortal soul and transcendent goodness, I think he's capturing both the notion of the forms and the supremacy of one form, or one super being in particular, the good.
Right. So, I mean, if you read something like the Phaedo, it's very clear. I think there are 3 or 4 arguments in that dialogue for the immortality of the soul. I mean, of course, Socrates is in his prison cell, so he's trying to reassure his disciples that he's going to be immortal, and then I suppose they're going to be immortal too. So, yes. and I think you can see, and many readers through the ages have seen that as continuous with Christianity. And I think you already said Nietzsche probably hated Platonism partly because he saw it as continuous with Christianity. So is that something that you think as well, as you see Platonism and Christianity as going together in some way, or?
Yeah, I think that Platonism gives sort of the basic metaphysical or even philosophical structure of Christianity. I mean, of course, Christianity existed as a religion before it came into contact with Greek philosophy, you know, at least in the person of the apostles, for example. Perhaps Paul was in touch with Greek philosophy. But until the councils really incorporated Platonism into Christianity, Christianity existed, but it was the councils who gave it shape. And so that shape, I think, is that there's an immortal soul and that there is this spiritual realm to which the immortal soul belongs. And I think those are just so fundamental to the post-Platonic and post-Christian worldview that we tend to forget that those are Plato's innovations.
Okay, so when I teach Plato to the students, I mean, I teach them about the forms, and it's very easy to caricature the forms. And I do a little bit of it myself because, I mean, ultimately, I guess I'm an Aristotelian about universals. I don't really think that they exist in some in some metaphysical realm and that things partake of them, as Plato seems to think. But, you know, I also try and get across to them that in a way it's a very appealing idea, and I think it's at its most appealing in mathematics. You know, because wherever you go in the world, you have two objects and two other objects, and they make four objects. And it seems to be this universal transcultural thing. Now, why is that? I mean, Plato's answer is that, you know, it partakes of this other realm in a sense. So, yeah, so is the idea of the forms itself an idea that you think is defensible and appealing in other spheres of life beyond mathematics?
Yeah, I think a transitional. So let me just say that when I introduce the forms and give the arguments for the forms as I understand them to my students, I do start with mathematical notions because, you know, they're willing to take on board the universality of the number 2 before they're willing to take on the universality of beauty, for example. But a transitional notion, and the one that Plato uses in the Phaedo, is equality. So you see an instance of equality, you see another instance of equality, and you're seeing the same thing in those two instances. And so the thing isn't over here and it isn't over here, because if it were over here, it wouldn't be over here. And if it were over here, it wouldn't be over here, but somehow it is. And the simple solution, I mean, I think the theory of the forms is remarkably simple. The simple solution is that it's in a way in both and in a way in neither. And the way in which it's in neither is that it's supersensible, that it's eternal, that it's spiritual, roughly speaking. And the way in which it's in both is, the word you used was partake, and that's very common, especially for scholars of Plato, to use that word, but I think it's a misleading word. I think it's a kind of Aristotelian word because it makes it sound like, well, there are these things, they're there already, and then they partake in something else. Whereas I think that the correct way to think of it as a Platonist is that these instances are projections or images of the original thing. Right.
I mean, that's, of course, what's implied or really spelled out by the analogy of the cave.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The cave for me, I start almost all my courses with the cave if it's appropriate. I mean, intro courses, for example, and of course, Plato courses. And one reason is that it just condenses everything about Platonism into one really simple and memorable story. You get the politics, the psychology, the metaphysics, the epistemology. It's all there in narrative form.
Why don't you just briefly describe that, because maybe some people listening haven't encountered it before. So what's the cave analogy roughly? I mean, I know it's a little bit tricky, but.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Could I just say a little bit more about equality?
Go ahead.
I think a more compelling case for the forms.
Yeah.
So you've got a basic argument that we both seem to agree on, which is that the only way to get repeatable instances of the same thing is to have some third thing of which they are instances. But he chooses equality, I think, deliberately, because first of all, it's got this kind of quasi-mathematical status that makes it easy to see the universality. But also that when we see pairs of things, we might see them as equal, but not completely so. So, I mean, really just at random, I've got a couple of shakers here. These are equal in a sense, or at least they're more equal than these two things are equal. So, you know, I say, here's some equality and here's another bit of equality. And so we can run that same argument we already said and say it's two instances and so on. But there's more to it. It's that when I say that these are equal, well, okay, they're both physical objects, so they're both in my hands, however we're going to characterize their equality, but they're less equal than these are equal. And once we sort of think about deficiency of equality and we're careful, well, these are also deficient in equality. This one has pepper, this one has salt, et cetera, et cetera. So when we look around and we see instances of universals, as you call them, we also see them as deficient to a greater or lesser degree. And Plato's explanation, and I don't know a better one, is that we could only see the deficiency if we already had a template that was perfect. So when I see these as deficient, I mean, they're pretty equal. I mean, I could have gotten away, as I do with my students, of saying, well, these are perfectly equal. But then, you know, there's always someone who says, well, there's a little bit of inequality and so on. Once you start acknowledging this fact about your experience, that you see instances of things, but that they're all to a greater or lesser degree deficient, if the best explanation of that recognition of deficiency is that you're seeing those instances in the light of a perfect, in this case, perfect equality. Well, you never find perfect equality in the sensible world through the five senses. So you're in contact with it, but it's not accessible to the senses. Well, you're in contact with it in some other way, super sensible or by using reason, by thinking about it in the way that we are now.
Well, this is one of the places that it gets tricky, though, isn't it? Because, that example with equality, I can see exactly what you mean there. And we can all, I think, intuitively grasp that, yeah, two things that are equal, that's perfect equality. Like if there were two playing cards, both the king of spades from two different packs, people would say those are exactly equal. Okay, maybe you look at it at a sort of microscopic level, they're slightly different, but basically they're equal to all intents and purposes. So we have a grasp of perfect equality. Now, if we move into other areas, perfect beauty, that's a bit more, it's a bit less intuitive. I mean, maybe we have a sense of what that would be like, but then you move into even more difficult universals or qualities. Perfect goodness, perfect truth, perfect justice. How do we get an intuitive grasp of that?
Yeah, so about the playing cards, just to make sure that you and I are understanding each other, if not agreeing, Plato's point is that we can get two things that are very, very similar, like I tried to illustrate with the Shakers or the two King of Spades, as you said. But even there, when we think carefully, we're not seeing perfect equality. We're seeing an approximation of perfect equality, but we're not seeing perfect equality. And the explanation of that experience is that, yes, we're not seeing perfect equality, but we can only judge it as imperfect equality in the light of a standard which is itself perfectly equal. So that must be, he calls it a form, which we know directly through reason and not through the sense.
Okay, so in that case, the argument would be that at every point when we perceive beauty or goodness in the world, there's a feeling of a kind of lack, which I think this is an argument in the dialogues. And that feeling of lack presupposes that we have a sense of the supersensible realm, which actually, to get down to brass tacks, I mean, I think in the Phaedo and other dialogues, it's kind of recollection, right? It's an anamnesis. And really the story is our mortal souls had dwelt with the forms in a previous stage of existence, right?
Yeah, that's the story. I don't think that in the end that makes thorough sense, because whatever epistemological problems we have here of accessing the forms, we would have had presumably if we were just like ourselves, but still existing in some other realm. There's got to be some other way of understanding the relationship between the form and the intellect that understands it. And it has to be some kind of identity. That's more of a technical question. But in other words, I think that the story of recollection is just that, a story, a noble lie, which is his way of expressing what I think he believes, which is that we're in contact with the forms right now. It's not just that we were in contact with them and we can remember our contact, but we're in contact right now. And the purpose of philosophical dialogue or philosophy more generally is to recognize that contact, not to give yourself some new information, but to recognize what you already know.
Okay, well, that's a good point to go into the cave analogy. Yeah.
Yes, although if I may, because you brought up the form of beauty and you suggested, I think rightly, that people are less willing to say there's a form of beauty than they are willing to say there's a form of the number two or a form of equality.
Yeah.
But that point about imperfection, and I think I saw you nodding and maybe I was projecting, but I thought maybe you were seeing what I wanted to say next, which is that it's true. People get into more disagreements about beauty. Maybe not. I mean, nowadays we have a lot of arguments about equality as well when it comes to social relations. But at any rate, people are less willing to say there's an absolute beauty or there's an absolute justice or whatever. But this way of understanding the argument for the forms, that in fact we don't perceive perfection in the sensible realm, accounts for the differences that people have. When it comes to, well, why do you need a form then? You need the form to account for the purpose of a conversation that two people who disagree about, say, beauty, the purpose that conversation would have, which is, if the two people are in good faith and they're not just saying, well, I'm going to tell you about my view so you can learn about my personality, and you tell me about your view so I can learn about your personality, which is, of course, how a lot of quote unquote philosophical conversations go these days, namely, let's share. Here's my perspective. Here's your perspective. But if the conversation is what Plato thought was an authentic philosophical conversation, which he calls dialectic, it presupposes that there is a thing that we're looking for. And so if you and I disagree about, whether Niagara Falls is truly beautiful or not, and you think it's not, and I think it is, well, if we're going to have a conversation about whether it's truly beautiful, we both have to agree that there is such a thing as true beauty. And then the debate will be, well, what is that? That's what the dialogues are. What is beauty? What is courage? What is it, et cetera, et cetera. And then when it comes to Niagara Falls, in the fantasy world where we were ever able to establish what that true thing is, to what extent does Niagara Falls fall short of that? Like, how deficient is it would be our common supposition, because we would grant nothing in the sensible world is perfectly beautiful.
Okay, but then someone might say that you're sort of, you're writing in Platonic presuppositions into the way that you've talked about that conversation between two people talking about Niagara Falls, right? Because they might want to say, well, let's talk about Niagara Falls, but I don't really believe there's such a thing as absolute beauty. But I'll have a conversation about, well, that looks beautiful to me and that looks more beautiful to you. And then you're in a sort of utilitarian realm where you're talking about kind of comparing preferences. And it might be a similar conversation to, do you think it's too hot in this room? That's another way of looking at aesthetics, right? Yeah, no,
that's exactly right. And that's why so many of the Platonic dialogues are encounters with the sophists, who have that view as a philosophy or a quasi-philosophy, depending on how we define that activity of philosophy. And Plato acknowledges that position that you're describing, not only in the practice of the dialogues themselves, but in the Republic, where he talks about dialectic in Book 5. He also talks about the lovers of sights and sounds. These are people who will not accept that there is such a thing as the form of beauty. They think beauty is in the sensible world, and they travel from festival to festival to behold beautiful songs and so on, and they're satisfied with that. Yes, Plato will say there are such people, but if they get together and they want to have a conversation about beauty, there are several ways that it can go. And he makes a distinction between two basic ways, dialectic, which I mentioned, and eristic. Eristic is the Greek word, is, as I'm sure you know, eris for strife. Eristic is a conversation that is full of strife, because they don't have a common goal. They don't even, so let me just again repeat that. Dialectic is where, if you and I are having a dialectic about whether Niagara Falls is beautiful or not, we're gonna, if it's a proper dialectic, we're both gonna enter the conversation assuming that there is such a thing as the beautiful, and then try to figure out what it is, and then to what extent Niagara Falls falls short. But if I think Niagara Falls is beautiful because I'm a Canadian, and you don't think it's beautiful because you're a Kiwi, and what's really going on in our conversation is we're just using Niagara Falls as a prop in our prejudicial battles about which is the better country. Well, it's true. We don't need a form of the beautiful to do that, because the goal isn't to find the truth of beauty. It's like to make you submit to my notion so that you can acknowledge that my country is better, or vice versa. And of course, I'm caricaturing. There are middle grounds, like the sharing idea of a conversation that I mentioned earlier. Plato's not, it's not even on his map, or at least he doesn't think it's worthy of consideration, a so-called conversation where I share and you share. I mean, I shouldn't say so-called. Those are valuable, like a dinner party. It's not every dinner party has to be a dialectic. You want to find out, what does the other person care about? Get inside their mind so you can get to know them better. It has its place. So Plato can acknowledge there are lots of different kinds of conversations, but what his point here is not that there isn't that diversity, but that if there's going to be one kind of conversation where the goal is to find the truth of the thing, then there have to be forms. There has to be something independent of the instances that the participants in the dialectic are going to try to understand.
Yeah, okay. I think that I've heard you debate free speech on campuses and topics like that.
Yeah.
And if I'm right about this, this is part of your view of why free speech is valuable in a liberal democratic society, right? That what we're doing when we have debates and conversations is actually trying to find out the truth. That's actually
in a university. Yeah, in a university, the goal should be to find out the truth. Like I said, at a dinner party, it's kind of pedantic. I mean, there are nice dinner parties. I was at one the other day. Like, people were actually interested in a certain question, and we pursued it. They were all philosophy students, but I wouldn't insist that all conversations. But yes, the point of a university, as I understand it, is to find what reality is like. And so, even though there's room for lots of different kinds of conversations, if they're not woven into a dialectic, then it's not a university. Then it's just pretending. which is what I think a lot of our universities are doing these days.
Okay, so you would use that argument for university settings and maybe think tanks and research institutes, but in society as a whole,
Yeah.
why do you think free speech is a good thing in society as a whole? Then does that have a different justification?
Not for me. So I wrote a series of articles for Quillette, and the argument that concerns this most particularly is in an article called "Liberalism Can Succeed," which was the second part of a review of Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. So the first part of the review was liberalism hasn't failed, and the second part was it can succeed. And whatever I think of liberalism now, I wrote that, I think 4 years ago now, maybe longer, 5. But at any rate, the argument that I made there, if I were going to defend liberalism, a society such as ours thinks of itself to be, the argument was exactly the same as the one for the university. Namely, the only rationale that I can make sense of for free speech is you need free speech in a dialectic that's pursuing the truth. So that if we have a society oriented towards, and when I say the truth, Plato is more specific, and I will be now in this context. It's not just any truth, like the truth about stamp collecting or whatever. It's reality, understood now as the forms, and particularly the reality of the good, this super form, if you will, this thing that's actually in his thorough conception beyond the forms. And so I just revert again to Nietzsche, that Nietzsche really saw that was it. Goodness, transcendent goodness. It's about that. So a society, as I understood it, that could be liberal, which is to say to grant free speech as an example, or some of the other rights in, say, the American Bill of Rights, it has to be oriented towards the good. And what I was doing there, what I called it Platonic liberalism, was saying, I think that liberalism actually needs Platonism to underwrite itself intellectually, but it's a quixotic project because the foundation of liberalism, as we all know, was British empiricism, or at least the sort of the practical matters of the British Civil Wars and then the American Revolution and so on. It wasn't a Platonic project. Some of those thinkers, whether it was Hobbes or Jefferson, they were explicitly anti-Platonic. So yeah. I was really trying to, as I say, do something quixotic, was to say, look, I really think free speech is important in life. I think Plato did too. And the rationale for it has to be a society that's oriented towards the good, where that can't be spelled out until we get a definition of it, which requires philosophy. And Plato even says, you're not going to get a definition of the good because it's beyond being. At any rate, free speech requires that kind of society. Liberalism understood platonically, but I recognized even then, we don't have liberalism that has a Platonic foundation. It's got a very different foundation. And so that's why I've moved away from that notion of Platonic liberalism, because I think that was a fantasy. I just don't think, when someone says liberalism nowadays, of course, one, first of all, gets understood as having certain progressive ideas. But then when you say, no, what I mean is classical liberalism, even there, you're retreating to contract theory, Hobbes, perhaps Hume, and so on. I just don't think there's any place to insert Plato there in a way that's going to make a difference.
Well, no, I think it's an interesting project, though. But immediate question for me is, so what was it about the usual justifications and the sort of classical foundations for free speech that you found dissatisfying?
Yeah, well, what's my problem with classical liberalism? The contract theory. I think that's just a fantasy. That's not how that's not how societies actually get constructed. So it's not a historical claim. And in the best thinkers, it was not meant to be. But then what is it doing? It's an idealization. And I think that the critiques of contract theory as idealizations is correct. So, take Rawls as an example. He's someone who's explicitly saying this wasn't a historical event. This is just the original position, as he calls it, where you get these abstract human beings who get together and make a decision about the best principles for a society, about how justice should look in their society. And the mistake there, I think, is broadly the anthropology. That is to say, he's imagining these abstract individuals. That's not what human beings are. And he would kind of grant that. But I think Deneen was right about this, that the abstract individual that liberalism always imagines as at its foundation, whether in an ideal contract or in a historical situation, isn't real. At best, it will only ever be produced by a liberal society. So let me make that a little more concrete. what you have in the original position, as I recall, is people who don't have any notion of the good. So that's to say they're not religious. And people are almost always, if not always, religious in a certain understanding of what it is. I mean, I think people always have a notion of the good, whether they admit it or not. So in that sense, they're religious. So it's imagining people that I think are actually impossible. Well, if not logically impossible, very, very hard to find. Although one does get people like this more and more as societies become more and more secular, people who at least think they don't have a notion of the good. And that's not an accident. Again, that was Deneen's point. I don't know if it was originally his or not, but at any rate, the point that our societies are producing the very kind of agents that it says are the agents who made the decisions to form the society this way. So it's got things backwards. The liberal individual is not at the root of liberal society. The liberal individual is produced by liberal society. And that makes it sound a lot more like a society oriented towards the good, namely, hey, people who don't have a notion of the good, that's the good. We want a society of people who don't have that kind of commitment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good criticism of Rawls, although I think even there's some slippage from your admission that the original position is really just a thought experiment to this idea that people aren't like that, because Rawls can just say, well, and for people who are listening maybe haven't read Rawls's really influential theory of justice. I mean, the original position is just the idea that it's a thought experiment for thinking about what justice is, and the idea is you kind of have these disembodied souls before they're born, before they go into society, and you're going to be one of them, and you want to design the society in a way that nobody's unhappy with the conditions. So you may be born as a disabled person, you may be born as a handsome person with lots of family wealth, you may be born in different social circumstances. And so I think Rawls intended that as a way of thinking about justice. But I mean, this is obviously part of the debate also about contract theories, which imagine a time at which the people were in a state of nature, as Hobbes says, and there are various versions of this, but the simple sort of Platonic form of this is that people sign a kind of implicit contract with a Leviathan, with the state, so that the state will supply security and that will help supply liberty and help produce commodious buildings and capitalism and all, whatever you want, basically, in a civilized society, in a true civilization. Okay, so that's, you dealt with Rawlsianism in an interesting way, but it strikes me that, in liberal democratic societies as a whole, I think people probably have different justifications for why they think free speech is a good thing, or why they used to think free speech is a good thing. And I think some of them are just based on maybe these foundational principles of liberal democracy, autonomy and freedom, or freedom and equality. So I think lots of people just think that free speech is part of our nature, or part of our understanding of ourselves as free and equal citizens. So the freedom element goes into this argument about self-disclosure, that free speech is about developing our personalities in a certain sense, in a sense that John Stuart Mill talks about. And if we're equal, then we have equal right to say things. So your your capacity to be offended doesn't trump my ability to put forth certain ideas within limits, that I'm not, actively abusing you. So what's wrong with those ideas? I mean, what's wrong with just the idea that free speech just comes out of the idea of the broader idea of political freedom?
Well, I have a couple of critiques, and they're nascent, so I'm thankful for this opportunity to think aloud about them. I've been writing a little bit about this. So one is just the general problem with freedom as a goal. Freedom is a means to a goal, but freedom isn't a contentful goal. So I think a society can't actually organize itself around freedom. It can organize itself around freedom for the purpose of achieving something. And that's what I was trying to say earlier, is that I think the only way to really ground freedom, to give it the philosophical heft that it needs, is freedom for the sake of finding the good, and thus discussing the good and so on. But I see that sounds very abstract, but I see that illustrated in the history of what used to be called the intellectual dark web, which was a loose organization of people who, I think it kind of coalesced in 2016, 2017, people who felt that campuses and to some extent society was becoming more restricted in what it was possible to say. So that was really the era of deplatforming speakers and so on. And that's continued. I think it was just, it intensified dramatically, especially after the election of Trump. when I think the left really got anxious and felt like if they didn't, get control of this conversation, that it was going to go down the wrong path. And that group gathered around the idea of free speech. And that was really the one thing that they all agreed about, because I remember seeing charts of the members and where they stood on various bread and butter political issues like social health care and abortion, at least the ones that divide people in the United States. And they were largely on the left, but there was a mix. And so the idea seemed to be, hey, here's a bunch of people who disagree about substantive political matters, the sorts that used to divide the left and the right, but they all agree that we need to have freedom of speech to debate these ideas, because they all have this confidence that with freedom of speech and debate, the truth would emerge, and that bad ideas would disappear. I think the fantasy was bad ideas would disappear, in the light of day. That sunlight is the best disinfectant for bad ideas, and if you hide them in the dark, they fester, and so on. I shouldn't say fantasy. That was the idea. I don't know. I don't believe it anymore, but I don't want to disrespect it that much. Well, what happened to that group? It didn't last. It dissolved, as far as I can tell. So there may be a few holdup members. I don't know that anybody even uses that word anymore. And in my telling, in the end, they had a common enemy, and they were resisting that common enemy, which was largely the left had moved in a progressive direction in a reaction against Trump. And it had arguably been moving further left, in the few years before Trump. Anyway, but at any rate, they had a common enemy. They were trying to protect themselves against this common enemy. But as events unfolded, I think that the pandemic, and then I think the Black Lives Matter protests, and then the second Trump election, 2020, I think those events really divided them. And it looked to, they started accusing each other of misinformation as that charge was starting to get serious, in the sense that you could get banned from Twitter, or at least have your account suspended if you were accused of misinformation, about vaccines and so on. And they started to take different positions on the 2020 election, or on the Black Lives Matter protests, or on especially the pandemic, and now on the Ukraine war. And as they started to take those different positions, they started to recapitulate what it is they were supposed to be fighting against, which was they were calling each other, spreading misinformation and so on, which was tantamount to saying that they shouldn't be allowed to spread that information, that they shouldn't have free speech. And so to me, that's an illustration of the broader abstract point that I was trying to make earlier, which is I don't think freedom can actually hold together a group, because it's not got any content. It seems to have content in a particular situation for a time when you get a disparate group of people who have the same enemy, and they just want to be free of that enemy. But if they have to make decisions over the things that they already disagree about, they're going to start limiting each other's freedom. That's one critique. I have a deeper critique, but we might want to talk about that a little bit first. But I'd like to give the second one as well.
No, give the second one, because I was actually going to critique your substantive idea, but
yeah, okay. Well, I'm happy to hear the critique at any point. But yeah, sure. Let me get out the second one while I can remember it. It's that. So if free speech is good because it allows us to express ourselves. I'm trying to remember the exact way you put it. We have autonomy rights, and we should be able to express our views.
Yeah,
because freedom is good for its own sake.
Yeah,
yes.
that kind of thing.
Okay.
I think there's many different arguments that start from sort of axiomatic values of equality on the one hand and freedom on the other, and some people even think these two things go together. So what would you say to those? So what's your second critique, I suppose, of those?
Yeah. Well, just quickly about equality. I mean, freedom and equality, I don't see them going together. They seem to me hostile. That anarchy produces inequalities.
Well, so, some people would say, this is kind of Ronald Dworkin's take, I suppose, that we're equally free we're free to speak if we're equally free to speak. If we're not equally free to speak, then we're not free to speak. In the sense of one person has much more power to have their say than I do, then I'm less free as a result, and that seems to stem from a difference in our power, that kind of inequality. That's the basic idea. But I know that you can come up with examples where they do seem to run contrary to each other.
Yeah. Well, let's bracket that for the moment. Let me make a second critique, because I think a second critique will kind of feed back into this. And it's hard. It's a little hard to express because. And this is just a change that's happening in my approach to all kinds of questions, political questions especially, that, there's the surface values, and then there's the institutions that go along with those surface values. And so when I hear, I don't want to name names, but certain commentators nowadays talk about liberalism, like they seem to me to be just talking about those surface values, and they don't recognize the reality of the institutions that you need to make those work, or at least seem to work. And I include myself, this is a self-critique. In other words, that article I wrote, 5 years ago or whatever for Quillette that was trying to defend a version of liberalism, I was naive in the sense that for me, it was just a purely philosophical question. Like, how can I give a rationally defensible justification of this concept? It wasn't about, well, what would this actually look like in practice? And could it possibly function in the way that it's saying? So yes, people should be free to speak. So, I believe that, you believe that. Well, what conditions are required for people to be free to speak? So, just to make an extreme case, if you and I have both been brainwashed, to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, and now we're free to do mathematics, well, I'm free to say 2 + 2 = 5, but I'm also free to say 2 + 2 = 4. Like, nobody's making me at the moment say one or the other, but I always say 2 + 2 = 5. You always say the same thing as well because of the brainwashing. So that makes the point really clear, although totally implausible. But I think it becomes plausible if you do the hard work of thinking about the institutions and the way in which they're having that effect on our society. So this gets to the cave. So maybe we'll fold that in at the moment. Cave, for people who don't know it at all, Plato imagines a cave where there are these people, I'll call them prisoners, at the bottom. And it's significant that they've been there their entire lives. Behind them is a fire, and in front of the fire is a low wall behind which other people are walking back and forth, but they're parading statues and models so that the fire is projecting an image of those statues and models onto the wall of the cave. The prisoners, as I call them, they've been there all their lives, fixed in seats so that they can only see the wall of the cave. In other words, they're living in an illusion, rather like a movie theater, but they've always been in that movie theater watching movies that are being projected by these, I call them puppeteers. And this is really helpful. Actually, this is not just helpful in this conversation. This is helpful in this way I have of thinking about this now. This is going to I'll be able to make this point clearer. That imagine giving those prisoners free speech. Like, nobody tells them that you can't say anything. They're allowed to say whatever they want. Well, terrific. On the surface, that's freedom of speech, but are they free to speak? Not really, because the only things that they can say are things about illusions. And that's the equivalent of what I was saying about the brainwashing. And so the root of freedom, it just can't be this nominal surface level ideology, which is now how I find most of the discussions of free speech. It has to be, what are the real conditions? And I use the word institutions. What are the institutions that are holding people fixed so that they're only looking at certain images on the wall, like the media, for example? The media is only feeding us certain things, then even if we have total freedom of speech, it's going to be a lot harder to imagine options to those other things. And I found this in my own life, that certain ideas, especially since I've gone on Twitter, that just don't get talked about in the academy. Once I encountered them, usually with a sense of revulsion and then curiosity followed by credulity, that it's very hard for me to remember what it was like to not think those things, because it's not like nobody ever told me don't think those things. I was free to think them. It's just they weren't on the menu of options for me to think. And that's what it's like to be a prisoner in a cave.
Right. So this is my main worry about what you're saying, though, is that, and you sort of reminded me of it just when you were talking there, because so basically what you're saying is it's not just about freedom. We're actually looking for something which is a substantive value, which is the truth.
Reality, which for Platonists is the good, but that's a bigger matter. Yes.
Sure. Okay. So however you want to find it, and you do have a well worked out, sophisticated view about what that is, and you take that from Plato. Fine. So my major worry about this is just that if you justify freedom of speech, you support freedom of speech with reference to the substantive value, then it's easy for that value to sort of crowd out other values, right? Because, and this has happened many times in the history of the world, in the history of liberalism, and the history of autocracies, And I know you don't want a sort of strong form of this where you torture people unless they espouse Platonism. But there's this danger, isn't there, that in the past people have said, well, look, Christianity is just the truth, or Islam is just the truth.
Yeah.
Or, you know, the fact that Kim Jong-il is the great leader, that's just the truth. And, you know, you're free to speak as long as you speak in this particular way. So why is, I know I have a sense your view isn't that, but in what sense is your view really different to that?
Yeah, well, this gets back to that notion of Platonic liberalism that I defended, where the orientation of the freedom is toward the good, but let's be careful now and distinguish the Christian notion of the good, for example, the Muslim, the Jewish, whatever, and the Platonic. And here there's a gap. So we talked, you know, because of the Nietzsche quotation, we talked about the similarities and there are some differences. So Christians think they know what the good is. You know, it's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's the magisterium, etc. There's a fully worked out account of what the good is, namely who God is, and you know what he's telling us to do, and so on. That's not Plato's notion of the good. Even if Plato's notion of the good was used by the church to give a metaphysical explanation, you know, to the philosophers, but Plato's notion of the good is something that, well, so many things to say. One is that to have an account of it would have to be an account that could be defended against all possible objections. Now, I don't think even, except for the most dogmatic apologists, I don't think most proponents of any particular religion think this religion is defensible against all possible objections. I mean, sometimes they'll say, well, that's a good objection, but it's a mystery, for example. Well, that's just not going to cut it with Plato. You know, you have to defend yourself. You know, if you say the Godhead is one God, three persons, you better give a pretty good explanation of that. And of course, there have been Christians who have tried, you know, Aquinas, for example. So there's that, but more fundamentally, the good is not a form like any other forms. In fact, I think it's a mistake to call it a form, because he says that the good is special because it's beyond being in rank and power. And being is another word for the forms. So he's got this idea of spiritual reality as having immortal souls who are thinking of the forms, and as intellect, they're identified with the forms. But then there's this super being, so much being that it's beyond being. And let me just be clear about that as much as is possible. Being has two senses in English. To exist. So if I say, you know, it is raining outside, there's rain, rain exists outside, or he is tall, where he exists, he is tall, he has a certain property or quality, or, you know, he is a rational animal, he has a certain essence. The forms are supposed to give the essences of things. They give the answer to the question, what is courage, what is justice, and so on. The good doesn't have an essence. It exists without any essence. And what that means is that you're not going to be able to get an account that is going to be fully defensible, not just because you're not good enough at it. You haven't read your Aquinas thoroughly enough. It's that it is beyond, certainly language, it's beyond thought, because what do we do when we think? We work with forms, which are essences. So that's a very technical metaphysical discussion, but here's why it matters in politics. Anyone who tortured someone, for example, because they felt you don't have the right notion of the good, couldn't be a Platonist, because the Platonist doesn't think that he has the right notion of the good, because it's built into Platonism that it exists without essence, so you can't have a notion of it. It's a goal that you could never possibly reach through language or even through thinking.
Okay, so then the question is, so you have this almost substanceless, substantive ideal. And the question is, I suppose, if you are looking at society and you are trying to sort of safeguard this value of free speech in the way that you understand it, and for you it's a value of free speech that's justified mainly as a way of finding out the truth, how can you tell that people are going down the wrong track, and how can you tell when it's sufficiently serious to actually justify any restrictions on free speech? Because that's where my main worry is, that this can be used to restrict free speech in particular.
Yeah, well, I'm not a free speech absolutist, and usually no one wants to be that, because then you allow people to make death threats, and you allow people to say fire in a crowded theater and so on. So I'm willing to accept the minimal limits on free speech, but beyond that, I'm a free speech maximalist. Let's say that for the reason that if somebody believes that what they're saying is their effort to discover what's real, then, especially about what's really good, then I don't see the problem. I don't see why it would have to be regulated as such.
Okay, so your view on this is actually quite close to a number of people who I don't think justify it in the interesting way that you do through Platonism. So, I mean, there's been this recent book by Jonathan Rauch with the Constitution of Knowledge, and in some ways it's not quite a Popperian view, but it draws on people like Popper, who talks about the philosophy of science, and it kind of views, in a way, it's kind of like a Hayek view. It views the whole of society as a kind of knowledge-generating apparatus, and the theory there is, well, this knowledge-generating apparatus is going to be better. We as a society are going to be better at seeing the truth, seeing reality, and maybe even seeing what goodness is, if people are free to exchange ideas. And this view has different features. I mean, some people think it's good to have sort of veto points so people can kind of cool their heads and think about things more. Some people say, no, it's good to have lots of voting and popular participation, because then it feeds in all the individual information in different locations. So do you like those kinds of views?
I mean, I'm willing to accept a plurality of interpretations of how this ideal could be put into practice. I mean, I have certain political commitments that make me uneasy about something I've maybe vaguely heard in what you were saying, but I certainly think that should exist, even if it wouldn't be my ideal system. Yes, that's right. And of course, a society understood this way, oriented towards the good or truth or reality or knowledge. I haven't read the Rauch book, but I liked what you said about it. It also has to, perform basic functions of society, like guarantee national security and, make sure there's clean drinking water and so on. But I think that those things can be justified as, like, how else are you going to pursue reality if you can't drink clean water and if you're getting, marauded by barbarians?
Well, also, I mean, I think in that view, you are better at war and you're better at supplying clean drinking water because your society has the capacity for people to put up their hands and say, hey, my drinking water in my local area isn't clean, without them being sanctioned. I mean, this is one of the things about the very early stages of COVID-19 in China. There were various medics who said, oh, there's this dangerous virus, and they were suppressed. And, in the end, it didn't go as badly for China as it might have. But I mean, that was probably not the best way of doing things.
Well, we're probably still in early days. I mean, I think it's been one big flaw of everybody's approach to COVID. We thought, well, within 2 weeks we understood it, or 6 months, it's just continually evolving, and we're continually seeing so many different aspects of the problem. It's almost infinitely complex. Before I lose this, though, I think you might like this, and I think it will enhance this discussion. So Fukuyama makes basically the argument that I'm hearing you representing Rauch is making for liberal democratic capitalism in the End of History book. And the basic, I mean, there's a complicated argument, but the basic point that touches here is that he thinks, I mean, the reason why he thinks that's the end of history, properly understood, because of course there's going to be a regression and so on. 9/11 didn't refute Fukuyama and so on. But the reason why he thinks that that's the best system is that it will ultimately win because it's the most oriented towards reality, which means its science will be the best, which means its economy will be the most productive, which means its military will be the most destructive, and it will win, even if it has temporary setbacks. And I thought that was pretty persuasive for a while, but this change that I described, 15 minutes ago in my thinking about politics, where there's the ideology, like that sounds really great, but how does it actually function? The name I would put to this shift that's happened in me with regard to this question is Curtis Yarvin, formerly known as Mencius Moldbug. And, he was anonymous for a long time, and I think that was crucial to the kind of work that he did, because some of it's the kind of stuff that would get you in trouble, talking about it in a university, for example. And I think he's done a lot of great work. But in this context, to me, the decisive point is that he talks about the details of how the American government actually functions. He knows it because his mother was in the civil service. So, when most of us talk about politics, we talk about, the legislators and the elections and so on. Most of the governing is actually done by the civil service, and we almost never talk about that. And that's a homogeneous group of people. I mean, they most of them vote the same way. Most of them are from the same economic class and so on. So you have this change of legislators, and you have potentially disruptive legislators, executives like Trump, but they make very little difference because there's this behemoth, now the name is that we all know is the deep state, this behemoth that is just it's like a what do we used to say, a cruise liner. It's going to keep going in the same direction. You're not going to be able to turn it around in 4 years. That's the government. And since that thing, the civil service, makes decisions by appealing to experts in the academy, for example, not just the sciences, but sometimes, the humanities when it comes to gender questions, for example, because it's, as Yarvin puts it, leaking power out to the academy, it corrupts the academy. Because if you think of the academy as just a pure truth-seeking institution, which is oftentimes its official ideology and the thing I think it should actually do. However, if you've got people who are, first of all, directly employed by government agencies, let alone, in other words, the logic that you wouldn't want, pharmacy professors employed by pharmacy companies, you don't want people who are doing investigative, intellectual inquiry into political questions to be employed by the government, especially because the government as such has an interest that the answers come out a certain way. Not just that Democrats want certain answers or Republicans want certain answers, but this civil service, this massive thing that has an interest in preserving and growing itself, is going to want answers that it's going to legitimate its growth and its stability. So he has a really good metaphor for this. And sorry if I'm talking a little too much this time, but he says, if you've got a lake and it is full of algae and you want to clean it up, it doesn't work to just like dredge the algae, because whatever's causing the algae is just going to rebloom. If there's fertilizer running off nearby fields, you gotta stop that fertilizer runoff before you clean up the algae. So when it comes to the corruption of universities, for example, they've got this great ideology pursuing truth and we're objective, et cetera, but more and more, I think I see that Yarvin's right, that the runoff is the political power coming from things like the civil service that are predisposing academics to think certain ways. And it filters down. I mean, the influential ones are the ones who get the appointments to consult with committees in the civil service and so on. But of course, they're the influential people in the field, and it filters out. Now, this was clearest to me in the case of gender.
I have nothing against that as a critique or as a discussion of exactly what's gone wrong with contemporary universities. I mean, you have private universities where similar things are happening, so there's that. But it strikes me that that's the kind of, and I don't mean this as a put down at all. It strikes me as a sort of classic right of center critique of the bureaucratic state and the ways in which bureaucracies can sort of develop their own momentum and their own interests, and that's fine. I just wonder, does that critique really knock down the Rauchian or Fukuyama view that it's liberal democracy in the broadest sense that produces or helps set the conditions for debate and improvement? Because even that critique itself, if people agree with you and then there are more private universities or the state has less of a heavy hand on universities, then that can improve things. And presumably even on things like gender, things will go back towards reality or at least some kind of balance.
Yeah, so you'd think so. You'd think so. Let me revert to the cave, which it isn't going to advance the conversation, but I think it'll at least help me orient myself. So it's what I was saying a while ago about people in universities are like prisoners in a cave. They think that they're having free debates, but in fact they're just debating these options that are being projected for them. And I'm sorry, I'm losing my point. Can you prompt me again? So we got Fukuyama.
You were saying, but basically, initially you were talking about Fukuyama's book, The End of History, which, by the way, I completely agree. It's been massively misread. It doesn't say this is the end of history in the sense that nothing is ever going to happen again. It's this kind of Hegelian idea that there's only one idea which is has broad appeal, basically. It's ideological.
Okay, I think I recapture that.
Yeah, okay, it just prompted me.
So yeah, Fukuyama's got this idea that liberal democratic capitalism is the best system, and it will eventually win, even though it's going to have some setbacks. And why? Because it's the most truth-oriented one. But if to instantiate liberal democracy, you have to have this deep state, this huge civil service. And of course, this is just a part of the story. Yarvin talks about various aspects of the government, one of which is the New York Times, which sounds implausible, but I think he makes a great case. One of the ways that he makes this case anecdotally is an anecdote from the 1960s. It was one of the Kennedy advisors who stayed on, I think, in the Johnson administration, George Ball, I forget which one, but he had an appointment at the Harvard School of Government. And I guess the New York Times was on strike for a couple of days. And he came in and made a joke to the seminar. He said, like, the government's not going to work because our inter-office memo service is down. The idea being everybody in the government reads the New York Times, or the Washington Post, but they don't disagree with each other. So it's the same thing. So the government now isn't just, what you see on TV or what's in the US Constitution, because the government leaks power. It leaks power to the academy, which he calls the cathedral. It leaks power to the media, which he calls the voice, and so on. And then if you start thinking of the government in that way, well, then the Fukuyama argument is not clean, certainly. And it's like an algae-filled lake. I don't think it actually works, because I think it'll work at the beginning, but the more power that leaks out, the more control that, for example, the New York Times and its, that legacy media, for example, and the academy, the more harmonious they are, the smaller the options for conversation, in that way I was trying to get at with the simple cave analogy. Namely, you've got everybody's talking about gender or the Ukraine war or whatever it is, and but they're only appealing to the 3 or 4 approved options that you're allowed to say in the New York Times, or that you're allowed to say in a university seminar. So the relationship between government, which is supposed to enforce what is found to be the truth, and the truth-seeking institutions in their purest form it's not a clean separation. So you get corruption both of the media, which I think is plain as day now, and you get corruption of the academy, which I don't understand how anybody on the inside can't see how corrupt it is as well. Another Yarvin sort of piece of evidence that I find persuasive is that the consensus of Harvard in any particular year in the 20th century seems left to the country at that time. So take 1915, whatever the consensus on the issues of Harvard was in 1915, that would have seemed to the left of American society in 1915. But that center of Harvard, which is to the left of American society, that becomes the center of the country 20 years later. And you get that pattern over and over again every decade. That's not a coincidence. And that makes it seem like Harvard isn't this pure institution that's disconnected. It's somehow involved in reshaping what is discussable in the society, and thus, controlling the projector that's putting the images on the wall.
Well, Harvard, of course, would just say, well, we're the clever people and we have good methodologies, and we find out what the truth is. Sorry, the truth has a liberal bias, by which they mean, in American parlance, a left liberal bias. And so the rest of the proles are just catching up with us.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, we'd have to talk about particular issues on which they say that, and I think they're right in some of the cases and they're wrong in other of the cases, and yet they use the same argument all the time. And
I think Yarvin's critique is a really interesting one, partly because it's interesting in terms of intellectual history, that it's a kind of postmodernism of the right, isn't it? It's saying that really these institutions which claim to be producing knowledge are not, and it's analyzing them from the point of view of power. And I don't think it's completely wrong, and I share some of his worries about how the universities have been corrupted, and I think state power has a certain amount to do with that. I don't think it's all the explanation. I guess I don't follow him the whole way, and I don't know if you do either, but I don't follow him fully in his sort of anti-democratic conclusions, just because I think that if it really is part of the problem that there's this bureaucratic elite which is separate from the demos, separate from the people, yes, and doesn't really have any feedback from their views, then surely the answer to that would be more popular participation rather than less.
Yeah, except that they don't like that, and they do everything they can to suppress it, seems to me.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, I guess something to push for rather than something that will be actually palatable to the current elites. But let's. I should let you go in about seven or 8 minutes, if that's okay. But do you want to go? Do you have to go now?
No, I can go as long as you want.
Because I know you got kids in the picture. But let me just. I wanted to raise one more thing, which again is really in this area of free speech and Platonism and liberalism. Because I've read some of your excellent essays on this topic, and I like to bring in the sophists and this contrast between the way that the sophists looked at speech and the way that Plato looked at speech. So do you want to just briefly talk to that?
Yeah, and I think what we were just talking about is a nice segue. So if I can just tie a bow around what we were saying, at least from my perspective, that I don't go all the way with Yarvin. I think that description you gave of him is interesting and perhaps true, namely is a kind of postmodern right, because I think for Yarvin, it is all just power. I think he is kind of a Nietzschean in that sense, whereas I'm not. I'm a Platonist. So my critique overlaps with his of the universities. I think that the power critique is effective to discredit what an institution that has become largely about power and not about truth. But I would say, in addition, it should be oriented towards the truth, where I'm not sure that there's a place in his philosophy for that. I don't want to say there isn't, but he talks mostly about politics and not about metaphysics. So I don't even know whether he has a view on that question. But the postmodern, as we're using it here, is a lot like the sophistic position that Plato was dealing with. At least that's how he understood it. And so that's why I thought it was a nice segue. So if I could frame the discussion about the sophists by just saying a little bit about Gorgias's encomium of Helen, if I may, because it frames how I think about Plato's encounter with the sophists. The Theaetetus as well. But at any rate, so Gorgias is this sophist, which in Greek, as you certainly know, and a lot of your audience will as well, it means wise guy or somebody with sophistication. They teach public speaking or rhetoric, which has got immense value in the democracies of Greece at the time. Gorgias shows up in Athens, and then these gentlemen want to learn how to speak persuasively so they can acquire political power and defend themselves in court, because, as you know, they didn't have attorneys. They had to either prosecute or defend in their own voice. So to demonstrate that he is this amazing speaker, and thus by implication can teach them to be amazing speakers, he gives this amazing speech, the encomium of Helen, the praise of Helen. So Helen is and again, as you know, but in case anyone in your audience doesn't know, Helen she's like the Eve of the Greeks. She's sort of considered like the source of the problem. She caused the Trojan War. And I think it was it Yeats who said she's the face that sailed 1,000 ships. Or maybe it was Keats. I get them confused because of the syllables. But at any rate, what's that?
Marlowe, man.
Sorry?
Marlowe, I think, is that line.
Oh, okay. Thank you. At any rate, to go and defend Helen, that's sort of like showing up in DC, on 9/12 and giving a defense of Osama bin Laden. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it's the bravado of it that's crucial to the event, because he's trying to say, if I can persuade you that Helen's innocent, I can persuade anybody that anybody's innocent. And if you're persuaded, clearly you want to study with me because I've got the good stuff. And his defense, because her crime was that she left in the middle of night with Paris, the Trojan prince, and abandoned her husband and their estate back in Greece, Menelaus. So why did she do that? Well, the obvious answer was she chose. She fell in love with Paris and she left, so she's responsible. And Gorgias is giving what we call in philosophy a determinism argument, that she was determined to leave. There was nothing she could do otherwise. It's not her fault as a result. And he says, well, what are the possibilities? What might have made her leave? Well, the fates. He goes through 4 possibilities. One of them is the fates, and not even Zeus can resist the fates, so don't blame her. She just did what was fated. Another is Aphrodite, which is to say she fell in love, but Aphrodite, as the Greeks understand her, is this goddess who can take over your life and there's nothing you can do about it. And, as you know, tragedies are written about this. So again, it's not her fault. There's one other that is escaping me for the moment, necessity or whatever it is. But the 4th is what's interesting. He says speech. Paris made her a speech. It's not like he got up on a rostrum, but that he said something to her that changed her mind and persuaded her to go with him.
Used as pickup artist tricks.
Yes, exactly. That's a good analogy. We might want to go into that in a moment. And, you know, you might think, okay, well, he made some arguments, you know, gave her some reasons why she should go with him. And it was her responsibility to say no, or to listen and just not to leave. But Gorgias defeats that argument by saying words are like drugs. And he makes another analogy, another speech that I'll mention in a moment, but just in that speech itself, words are like drugs. Well, you know, like think of Bill Cosby when he gave drugs to those women, like whatever happened wasn't their responsibility afterwards. So if you think of words as drugs, then if the speaker, at least the good speaker like Paris or by implication Gorgias, if he gives you a drug, there's nothing you can do. So if words function like drugs, no more freedom, at least in the hands of the persuasive speaker. In another speech, he gives an even more expansive understanding of speech. You know, he's up on all the latest theories because he, you know, like all clever speakers, he wants to sound like he's, you know, really at the cutting edge. You know, this would be like using neuroscience nowadays. And he says, speech is just like fine atoms coming out of the mouth and striking the listener's ear. Well, Democritus, this is the atomistic theory that was circulating at the time, that's a deterministic theory. If the atoms come out and they strike something, they're going to cause a necessary effect. So if speech is just atoms and my ear admits those atoms and that sets a deterministic chain of events in motion, then I'm not responsible, because if the speech is perfectly calibrated, it's just going to be like putting a drug in me that's going to make me more pliable, for example. And of course, he's demonstrating all this by giving this amazing speech. Okay, so I forget your precise question, but let me just say why I'm bringing this up. That if that's, you know, we just let that stand for the moment, is if that's the sophist's approach, that speech is like a drug or it's actually like physical force, then it's not possible to have what Plato calls dialectic, to refer back to what we talked about earlier. It's not possible to have a conversation where you and I sit down together and we give words to each other, not to control each other in the manner of drugs or you know, like little baseball bats that are gonna, you know, batter you so that you won't fight anymore. But my words are not going to go in as controlling forces, but they're going to go in as reasons, where you have freedom to entertain and endorse that reason or entertain and reject that reason. So it's not a coincidence, I think, that speech is simultaneously saying speech is not rational. It's a drug or it's an atom. And it's using that to say she's not responsible. In other words, she's not free. Because freedom and rationality go together. I think Aquinas makes this case really, really well in the Summa, in question 83 of the first part, that to reason, we have to be free. Because if you speak in a way that determines me, well, then I'm not rational. That's just like pushing this pepper shaker off the table. Speech is just a fancy way of pushing. So for a dialectic, speech can't be pushing. What is it then? And I think that's Plato's point of resistance against the sophist. He's saying, I think dialectic is possible. I think truth-seeking is possible. I think it's actually really good. It might even be the best thing in life. And the only way it's possible is if there are reasons which are not physical forces that don't compel. And then the epistemology and so on is there to give an account of, well, what must the world be like for that to happen? And that's where the forms come in.
Right, so I think that's a great example. It's a great way of discussing it, because it's very much the case, I think, on current college campuses and even in some of the debates on social media, that people see speech, and sometimes they use these terms, misinformation and disinformation, as kind of quite compelling in a very strong sense that if people are exposed to this idea, you go on that, you see someone posting that vaccines don't work, it's almost like automatically that will spread. And you know, it obviously has a certain impact. There's going to be a certain percentage of people who are persuaded. But I think it does forget what you're saying is that people also have the capacity to digest these ideas and maybe to reject them. I mean, that's another analogy you use, right? That it's not just like something going into your body. Or if it is something going into your body, you can actually digest it, take from it what you want. And that's actually kind of a halfway house if you think of it in that way, is because it acknowledges that, yes, there is going to be some influence, but you
Yeah.
also have some control over it. There might be more control than you think, and other people might have more control than you think. So in some ways, I kind of like the idea of texts as drugs, because you read Plato or Borges or Robertson
Yeah.
Davies, and it's kind of like, whoa, this is looking at the world in a new way. But you still have, you've taken the substance, but you're able to kind of drive yourself in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the combination too. And the way I elaborate on this, the summer of the pandemic, 2020, when I published that article about Plato and the sophists and so on, using this Gorgias encomium of Helen example, was he, of course, wasn't a virologist. He didn't know anything about viruses, but I think viruses are what he really needed, because that's not just a drug I give to you, but if it's a virus I infect you with, you can then spread it to other people. And that's how people think of misinformation, as if they're viruses. But if you think of ideas as viruses, then of course you're going to want to control so that we don't all get sick. But what that leaves out is that we have immune systems, and we can do things to build up our immune systems. And that's reason, the immune system, and education, which builds up the immune system.
Yeah, actually, you've brought up something that I just thought of now as well, which is that I don't like this virus analogy, even when it's used in cause that I find just. I mean, I'm thinking here of Professor Sade in Montreal. God Sade, he often uses this analogy that wokeism is like a virus. And in some ways, I don't disagree. But I mean, first of all, from a philosophical standpoint, it's not a critique. It's not a criticism. It's a kind of it's kind of an insult thrown at it, right? So that's unhelpful. But also, it kind of gives into this way of thinking about ideas that people have can have no defense to it other than just to say it's a terrible virus, run away, rather than say, oh, let's look at some of these ideas. Yeah. As we've been doing today as well with Curtis Yarvin and people that maybe some people would say, oh, it's too dangerous to even talk about. But often when you think about these things and you think, immediately, I mean, maybe my brain's just like this because I'm an academic or something. I mean, this isn't a boast, it's just a weird thing, but you hear ideas and I immediately start thinking, well, that sounds wrong, that sounds wrong.
Yeah.
Makes
academics
bad at dinner parties.
Yeah, I think Plato has both. I mean, he doesn't have the virus analogy, but that people are largely prisoners in a cave. So that's like the virus. They're just being fed images and they're, being rational, which is to say discussing them, but they're not actually getting anywhere because they're just dealing with illusions. That's like the Curtis Yarvin point. That's just like, it's all ideology, it's all power. But Plato allows the possibility. He's not saying it's going to happen, but he's allowing the possibility that you can escape. And what is the way to escape? Philosophy, which, as you know, is just a Greek word, the love of wisdom. It doesn't have to have any content. It then becomes a question. Well, what is wisdom? What is it to know? Is there a difference between wisdom and knowledge? And you're off to the races with philosophy as we usually understand it. And so one thing I like about Plato is one can simultaneously say, yeah, these postmodern power critiques, whether they come from the left or the right, formally doesn't matter. They're onto something. They're right about maybe 99.99% of human interactions. But what Plato adds is, but it doesn't have to be that way. It's possible to pursue truth, or just to show the range of this, the Christian example, it's possible to love with charity rather than with possession or whatever. And I see those as saying it's possible. And then once it's possible, well, what does the world have to be like so that it's possible? And what can we do to accentuate that possibility? And, briefly, his answer, if it's not clear, in my interpretation, is to make it possible, there have to be forms and the good and an immortal soul, and what can accentuate it? Philosophical education. Yeah,
I mean, philosophical education, and there I was going to go at it from a different angle, but you kind of joined up with where I was going there, which is this sort of John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff emphasis on educating people for debate, and part of that I think is just to sort of, they talk a lot about cognitive behavioral therapy, and part of that is just to say, well, look, you have all these fears that you're not going to be able to cope, that things are going to overwhelm you, but actually have a go. Yeah. And even if it's a dangerous idea that you think is absolutely appalling, you'll probably be able to cope with it. And not only that, it'll strengthen you in the sense that you'll immediately start generating, maybe sometimes you'll be convinced, but sometimes if you're not, you'll be able to evolve these antibodies to combat these ideas you dislike.
So I like Jonathan Haidt. I like that book. I teach it regularly, but I'm critical of it in a way I wasn't, when it came out. And Haidt was important for me in those years, 2016, 2017, when the intellectual dark web was coalescing and so on. Like, he helped me. But I just wrote a long thread on Twitter 3 or 4 days ago, criticizing his latest, what he calls like the summation of all his views, which is about his take on social media and how it's corrupting our democracy, as he calls it. And just to summarize my critique of Haidt's approach now, it's that it's too, well, at least in the version that you were giving of it, of the cognitive behavioral tricks that we can teach people so they become better behaved in debates. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't work to some extent, but I think that it's missing the source of the problem. It's like cleaning up the algae without getting to the fertilizer runoff. So that, if you're able to train people to, sit still and listen rather than screaming chants against a view that they don't like, okay, that's an advance, I guess. But if the debate is happening within a narrow window, like, does it really matter in the end whether people are chanting or listening and exchanging reasons? The basic problem is the window. Like, why aren't they, you're talking about this or this, why not this thing that's way over here that's actually true? Why is that not part of the debate? And Haidt just seems too non-political. He's focused on the individual. That's that notion of cognitive behavioral therapy. Like, let's focus on the individual and let's train people and let's make these policy tweaks and so on so people are better behaved and, control social media and so on. I mean, for example, this was part of my thread, he thinks there shouldn't be anonymous accounts on Twitter. And, because part of his account of how social media corrupts our democracy is, people say mean things on Twitter or whatever, they're abusive or they spread misinformation. I can't remember this precise point, but I think that would be a disaster, because I think it's the anonymous accounts that are saying this stuff. You're not saying A or B, they're saying X or Y. And sure, sometimes it's crazy conspiracy theories, but sometimes it's right. So take the lab leak theory, for example. They were the ones they were right on the lab leak theory from the beginning. And that was not something you were allowed to say in the early days in polite company or publish in the New York Times or discuss in government debates and so on. But I think it was true, and I'm not going to be able to prove it. I haven't done the investigation to even stand up in a debate, but I mean, come on, that this weird virus that they happen to be working on this institute just happened to explode in that particular area within a few miles of the institute. It just, anyway.
Yeah, no, so now I would be much happier if there was just no screaming and shutdowns of controversial speakers. I think that would be a real advance and a real relief. But I do take your point, and it's something I've been thinking about over the past few years, being involved with Heterodox Academy and other movements like that, yeah. At the same time, I wanted to be defending civility and philosophical discourse or dialectic. And on the other hand, I also want to be defending quite a strong principle of free speech. And sometimes these two things are in tension, because if you have too strong a norm of civility and how things should be, then it risks pushing aside some modes of expression.
Yeah. And I think people should be well behaved. You're right. I'm not for screaming. I don't think it accomplishes anything, at least in the context that we're talking about, like universities. Street protests might be another thing. But at any rate, in the context we're talking about, I want people to be civil and well behaved, because I just don't think it really does much. What I'm concerned with is which ideas are allowed to be discussed and which aren't. And without anonymity, the way our regime works nowadays, for those, I believe, the Yarvin reasons that I was giving earlier, the way our regime works, new ideas are just not going to come in except through anonymous sources, because the window is too narrow.
Yeah.
So
I agree. So at the risk of further curtailing speech, I should probably go, because I've got this meeting with students in a while. But thank you so much for that. I think I really enjoyed that. And I hope you do continue with your project of Plato-derived liberalism, because I find it very fascinating. I'm sympathetic to it partly because I also have this tendency of my own that I got into classics and I like classics, and I think, well, how can I speak to the modern world? And I mean, one of my things is I can use Protagoras to better justify democracy. And you go out into the real world and you try and tell people that, it sounds a bit harebrained, but maybe it's the right idea, right? Maybe this is one of those ideas that we need to actually have in public sphere.
Yeah, well, isn't that what Rorty tried to do? I mean, that's my understanding of Rorty.
I haven't even read Rorty, so back to the drawing board for me.
Yeah, well.
I'm just going to end the recording, so thanks, Patrick.
Okay.